Yeah, we're just arriving in the space. This is what we consider to be an open session of the Resonant Man, which is the men's circle that Jacob and I, or the men's initiative that Jacob and I co-founded last year. Very much inspired by the work of Thomas Hubel, which some of us have experienced directly or are experiencing, but also many other influences. Jacob brings a lineage of the practice of dialogos, dialogue inspired by David Bohm, the physicist, and Krishnamurti, the spiritual teacher. And we're blending many practices and the influences of many teachers into this space as we meet every Sunday for our men's circle component. But from time to time, we like to open our doors and invite everyone who's interested in this work to engage in a shared inquiry together into a topic. We've looked at the question of how men's and women's circles can help transform culture. And we've also had a very special guest, Danny Cohen, who some of us know very well, speaking about the new science of collective healing. And today, of course, we are addressing the porn industrial complex and the metacrisis, which is a huge topic, not perhaps spoken about enough or acknowledged or investigated adequately. And we want to play our part in changing that. And of course, in this space, we like to really acknowledge the quality of the field that we create together to step into a space of shared awareness. And so I'm going to invite everyone just to take a moment to just take a breath and just feel how it is to be here now, present together. Maybe you like to close your eyes if that feels good to you. And maybe exhaling a little longer than usual, maybe even riding the breath down into the body. And just noticing how you feel right now, being here. Starting with the body, whether you might be feeling the influence of gravity grounding you, feet on the floor, back against the chair. There's a kind of a comforting quality in gravity, something we can always rely on. And then maybe taking just a moment to notice how you are at the physical level. Maybe tuning into those parts of the body that feel open and energized. Maybe there are pleasant sensations, relaxed feelings. Maybe areas of tension or numbness, just noticing those. Yeah, breathing out and checking in now at the emotional level. Maybe there's some energy active from the day still, residues, stresses, resistance. Or maybe you're feeling open, spacious, peaceful. Whatever's alive at that emotional level, just noticing. Exhaling again. And taking a moment to check in and noticing the quality of my mental experience. Is the mind very busy? full of questions, stories, projections into the past or the future. Or maybe there's a little more space, a little more spaciousness arising. Perhaps I can notice the gaps between the thoughts. Yeah, holding these three levels in awareness. Now sensing into the space together. Noticing how it feels to be gathered with these other souls today, all drawn by this question, this inquiry. Something in each of us responded to this invitation. And perhaps we're coming for different reasons, but we can all take a moment to sense into this field of shared awareness that is cohering between us, this field that has its own intelligence, the field that will hold our inquiry, even as we touch on topics that could be challenging, touching on layers of collective pain, perhaps shame, perhaps numbing, even anger or grief, whatever's here. We have great capacity when we come together to hold these collective topics and discover the impulse towards ethical restoration that lies on the other side of that sensing and feeling each other here. Maybe inviting you now to just bring your attention to your heart area for a moment. Noticing how it feels to be gathered with all these other hearts in the space. And feel very warmly welcome on behalf of the Resonant Man. And in your own time, arriving back, landing in the space of our shared inquiry. Maybe opening your eyes if they're still closed, and just taking a moment to notice who's here. Yeah, welcome. So good to see you all. And yeah, maybe Jacob, you'd like to set the scene a little for what's going to happen in the next hour and 20 minutes or so.
Wow, thank you. That was a beautiful state shifting meditation, as always, Matthew. Definitely feeling a different state. And yeah, really pleased to welcome such a large group for this event. It's a really pertinent inquiry for Matthew and I, and something that I personally have been fielding and exploring for many years now. So it's really nice to sort of land it now within the Resonant Man field, within the Hubble field to a certain degree as well, and of course within SENSESPACE Studio, which is hosting the event today. So we're going to be presenting and exploring some of the key elements of how we understand this issue of porn addiction culture in the context of metacrisis, starting with like direct experience and how it transforms our minds and relationships to ourselves and relationships to other people, and then going forward, we're going to explore more of the civilizational big picture impact, which we believe is probably the least explored component of this conversation. And then after that, we're going to be opening up for some dialogue with all of you here. And we really want to have a dialogue with what emerges, what's alive in the space. Encourage you to speak from your own experience wherever possible in the context of that dialogue. And yeah, just a note on recording. We do tend to record these events sometimes if we feel like they're going to be of service to the larger field. We like to ripple them out with Matthew's newsletter, Resonant World, and on SenseSpace Studios newsletter. And there are some people who aren't able to attend today who are really keen to join us. So if you are, for any reason, unhappy to appear in that, you can drop your question in the chat, or you can speak your question and then write us, and we can cut you out in the post production process. So that's kind of the format.
Yeah, and just to emphasize as well that obviously many of us here are very well practiced in various protocols for dialogue, transparent communication, of course, as taught by Thomas Hubel, which very much emphasizes speaking from our experience, from our embodied experience, from our emotional response, and of course, from our thoughts, and welcoming as well pauses, time to reflect, digest what's said, and inviting all of us to listen with as much energy as we would use to speak. And if we feel like something's been said that really demands our response, that we want to respond very rapidly, maybe just taking a moment to settle and allow yourself to respond as far as you can from that place of pause. It's one of the real core practices of the Resonant Man that, of course, many of you will know I brought from the Thomas Hubel work. And we've found that practicing this type of transparent communication, or resonant dialogue, as we call it, in honor of the dialogos practice that Jacob is a real master of, we found that it's really created a field, a transformational, nourishing field for the men who gather each Sunday. And we wish all of you to partake of that field as you arrive with us this evening as well, and feel some of that nourishment and hopefully some of that insight and collective intelligence that starts to operate when we observe these practices. So thank you for that. And I know that I'm speaking to a very mature field of individuals here. So it's a real honor that you're all present and here. Yeah. Well, maybe I should ask you, Jacob, to begin as we move into our dialogue now. Why is it that you have spoken publicly on these themes? You've made YouTube videos, Instagram posts, you've written about this topic, which, let's face it, is a topic that many of us, I think, would think twice about before posting about and acknowledging. And certainly even this morning when I was writing about this event on LinkedIn, I had a moment of pause thinking, should I really go there? This could be misinterpreted in some way. What will people think of me? I had that response. And then I thought, well, the work we're doing is so important to shine a light on this part of, I guess, what Thomas Hubel would call the trauma architecture that we're all sitting in, whether we're aware of it or not, that I just overcame that resistance. And maybe some of you even found your way here via LinkedIn, which would be very rewarding to hear. But tell me, what is it about this topic that has prompted you to stick your head above the parapet in this way?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first preface is that it doesn't feel like sticking my head above the parapet for me. I just have an unusual disposition with respect to certain topics where I just don't feel any of the flack, so to speak. But I think more deeply, there's a sense that I think many here will share that, like, the area that has been some of your deepest work is the area that you are most called to speak to and share on. And because I've been on such a long journey with this, I've developed such a complex and nuanced understanding of it within myself that I found, like, when I speak about it with other men, very often there's a response of like, oh wow, like I didn't really think about pornography in that way. And of course, there's such a poverty of conversation, especially like well developed conversation around this topic, that most of us are just in our own fragmented and narrowed boxes. Now, for me, this has been what amounts to probably, let's see, well, I'm 29 now, and I first started engaging with pornography when I was probably around 15. So, and it's been a whole arc getting on to 13, 14 years or more of coming to really understand what this thing is, what its effect is upon me, how I relate to it, and what is the actual context and container and medicine that can allow me to move beyond it.
Well, let's dive into that a little deeper. Maybe you could say a little more about the impact that you noticed pornography was having on you.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, most of this I only recognized in hindsight after having undergone a degree of healing and integration myself. I didn't have my first sexual partner in relationship till I was 19 years old. So in effect, I was engaging with pornography for about 4 years prior to that, which is a really long time in terms of habit formation. And what I really came to understand in later years is that pornography really is rewiring the mind. And it's rewiring the mind of men in particular who are like of an age in which their mental faculties are not fully developed. So there is a degree to which we're like exposing the youth or kind of sacrificing the youth's minds on the altar of the porn industrial complex because we really don't have any capacity to defend ourselves, especially when like even having the conversation around it is such a awkward thing. It's sort of teenagers educating teenagers, all the while being exposed to a behemoth ocean of super stimulating material, which when you're at that age is a drug like no other. It's a super stimulating drug, and you will just keep going back for more. But what you don't understand is that that drug is rewiring you. It's basically shaping your sexuality to be a super highway between your mind and your visual capacity and your genitals. And it's kind of skipping everything in between. And that's what's being programmed again and again. In addition to that, it's also shaping a kind of subject object relationship because your sexual stimulation comes from participating as a kind of non participant viewer, right? And part of the fragmentation is we think this isn't going to affect our sexual union and communion and relationships, but obviously it does. And so when you actually come to have a sexual relationship with a woman, in my case, which is, in many ways the most sacred and precious thing we can have, you'll find, okay, actually, there's a whole process now of unwiring and rewiring those tendencies um, in relationship to them. And that's been a journey too. So
Mm.
that's how I would preface it.
I feel like you've just made a very powerful statement where you've really almost described the anatomy or the impact this use of pornography can have on your own internal circuitry, that you are in some sense rewiring yourself. As you said, there's a kind of connection, a visual, almost visual genital connection, and the rest of the body is almost absent in that experience. And I'm keen to return to the point about how this affects men at a young age, because we know that boys are looking at extremely hardcore pornography from very young ages, much younger than 15, which is another huge dimension of this I wanted to briefly presence. But I'm also really curious about that process of self-discovery, because you talk about it so articulately now. You have it so clear. But in those early sexual encounters, I assume it may not have been as clear to you as you were beginning to recognize this rewiring influence that you described?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's two big pieces that come to mind with respect to that. And the first is that during my university years, whilst I was doing my history degree in London, I was also exploring LSD. And that kind of started a journey of introspection that led me into meditation. And the effect of these experiences, whether with psychedelics or meditation, was to create these boundary dissolving experiences. And I started to find these arbitrary fragmentations in my mind were being dissolved. And it's through that process that I started to realize, like, oh, in my head, I'm going and doing this thing over here on my incognito window. And then I close the window and I close the laptop and I go away to the rest of my life. And it's like not part of the rest of my life. And I think that's actually how the vast majority of men using pornography are operating, is as if it's kind of a separate thing that doesn't interact with the rest of life. But that is the fragmentation. And it is affecting who you are when you step out onto the street, and you like who you are in your body when you relate to a woman has been reshaped, not the least because you've just spunked away your essential life force and your seed energy, to put it, in in perhaps uncouth terms. But this is another component of it: is men are not being kind of initiated into an awareness that there's a sexual energy and life force within their bodies that can be cultivated and conserved, and is actually like really relevant to their creative vitality, their capacity to step out into the world, their capacity to like have a generative flow of energy with women. All of that is being diminished when we're in this addict like relationship with our own sexuality, which is just like, oh, there's too many stresses in my life. Go and use this tool of pornography to release that stress or give me a quick sort of feeling of up and a high. But then afterwards, of course, you're left feeling a little bit empty and actually physically emptied of some of your energy as well.
Mhm.
So that points us towards some of the broader implications of this too.
Mm, mm. Yeah, yeah, we'll come to those in just a few moments. But I also wanted to just notice how I'm noticing the intensity of the focus on what you're saying in the space. Like I feel like what you're saying is really being deeply received by the field here. And I can almost hear questions bubbling already in our shared space. And I want to assure everyone we're going to come to an opportunity to dialogue as a group in the near future. But as we move in that direction, I'd like to ask you, I guess, a couple of questions which blend into one another. The first is, how widespread a problem is this? And what is the effect at the social level of presumably large numbers of men, as you say, squandering this vital energy and engaging in this addiction in a way that is far more, I think, invisible than, say, more obvious addictions like alcohol or even work or all the other ways we numb ourselves. This one tends to be the most private and least discussed, I suspect. What's the what's the bigger picture impact of that?
Yeah. I mean, I don't have the numbers to present to you. I think it's incredibly widespread. I
Mm.
think it's incredibly common. And the more frank and honest spaces of conversation we have with other men, the more we realize just how much this is just under the surface everywhere. Um, I've been participating in a lot of the discourse around what's being called the metacrisis. And that comes from a recognition that our seeming incapacity to respond to the breakdowns in our institutions, in our systems of education, our incapacity to adapt to a massive amount of change that's happening right now, has something at core to do with our capacity to relate. both with ourselves and with one another in relationship to the sacred or our higher selves or high reality. Um, and once we take that on seriously, once we really entertain, like, okay, our capacity to be intimate with what's happening in the world is key to our showing up to it, then we can start to see that pornography and like massive scale porn addiction is parasitically undermining all of those things. So it works on our connection with ourself and undermines it because we're participating in an addictive behavior that doesn't actually feed us, which is why we feel kind of shit and empty after doing it. It's undermining our relationship with the other in a deep psychic way. And then it's undermining our relationship with sacred world because we're in a sense profaning ourselves and our relationship with sacred reality, and we're really reducing our full-bodied soulful self connection, which is sort of the portal through which we participate in the fullness of life and can maybe become a vessel for something, some sort of transformative transmission or creation to come through us. And so that's pretty dang serious in my books. And then alongside that, we have the issue of sovereignty, which is something we focus a lot on in the Resonant Man and men's work more generally, is like how many leaks are in our boat right now. And those leaks very often take the form of addictions. And if we're fostering this massive addiction in the context of pornography, to what extent are we actually going to have the kind of conserved and cultivated integrity and energy to address and step out and kind of go beyond the current level of our capacity to really serve the community and the issues that are pressing in the world? And then lastly, something that's just come through for me in the last few weeks with a lot of conversations around AI, and a sense that young people's minds in particular are going to face a real crisis of vulnerability to simulation and to not being able to distinguish AI and robots of various forms from subjects, like soul endowed human subjects. This is a problem that's kind of coming down the pipeline. Well, from my standpoint, collective pornography addiction is actually making us much more vulnerable to simulation because we're actively participating in one in a way that interacts with the deepest architecture that we have, in a way, which is our sexual architecture. So if we want to be resilient in the face of simulation and simulated relationship entering more and more, and of course highly realistic sex dolls are certainly coming onto the marketplace in the next 5 years or something, if not already. Um, this is one of the core ways we can prepare ourselves, is to address this problem in a really succinct way.
Yeah, there's other themes I'd really like to broach as well. I mean, we haven't yet touched on the impact of the porn industry on women, both the women who are participating, many of whom are participating under some form of duress, and of course on women in relationship to men who are experiencing an addictive relationship with porn. But we have plenty of space here to address those and other questions. But I'd like to offer offer the floor to open up a little now and see if there's anyone who has any resonance or any question or anything that you'd like to bring in response to what's been said so far. I don't think we need to raise hands unless you're off camera. Then please feel free to raise your hands. But otherwise, yeah, I'm curious. I sort of sense there's already some quite big questions coming through, and I want to make sure that there's some space for the collective intelligence to start to stir.
All right, so thank you. I'm Young here, and I'm part of the men's group, and I'm also part of the Thomas Hübel training. Yeah, so deeply resonating with the topic. Although interesting enough, so for me personally, I've only maybe watched 3 or 4 porns in my entire life. And but like a lot of the problems that were mentioned in between you still resonate nonetheless.
Mm.
Um, there's something I want to bring up in particular, which is just this last week I encountered a really interesting line or sentence that goes, women tend to have a sexuality, men tend to only have a sex drive. Which I thought was so interesting. They're like just even just the term themselves, I felt was already very telling. Like once, of course, there are always exceptions, and that's actually what we're getting into. But still, generally, that the idea is that women can have a very beautiful, multi-dimensional, very nuanced and subtle, sexuality. But men, and which I can resonate with, tend to only have a sex drive to satisfy, to via porn, via, whatever that is. Or I would consume like images to, satiate my sex drive. Um, and I guess the question is just sort of like if we can sort of agree on this premise, how could men also, explore our different paths into a more wholesome and multidimensional, and genuinely we can call beautiful sexuality?
Mm. That's a beautiful question, Young.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, beautiful question. How can men cultivate this? I'm hearing sacred relationship with their sexuality, and I wonder what the role that men's work can might play in that, or the role that men's work could be. Jacob, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, picking up in reverse order, I think from the standpoint of like how can we actually help someone who's currently addicted to pornography begin to railroad off that? My philosophy is that any kind of moralizing is completely unhelpful. And I think part of the dilemma that's led us to where we are with this just like free range market of pornography is this false kind of this dialogue between sort of the sexual liberation movement and like conservative, fairly anti sexual, pro family culture. And there's a possibility for something new to come through now, which is a little bit more nuanced, I would say. But in practical terms, it's about bringing more awareness to it. And
Mm.
so, because of this fragmentation, we're going to slide into pornography without even knowing we're doing it. And the thing that having the kind of collective awareness of being in a men's group does is like you slide into it and then you go and you speak with your men's circle around that. And that builds a kind of coherence of connection around it. And so then you can have more and more awareness of what's it like to have the impulse arising, what's the awareness you can maintain whilst you're entering into it, how do you feel afterwards, and gradually sort of unraveling that fragmentation so that if I still slip up and I go into porn space and I watch things, I come out, I don't just like put that in the box and forget about it. I actually take time like the next day or a few hours later and reflect on like, oh, what was I watching? What was the context of that? Who were the people involved? And all of these things that you ignore when you're just blindly entering into the simulation.
Mm.
But I think what came through for me really profoundly in what Yang said is for me, the deeper reality of all of this is the widespread reality of sexual trauma for men more broadly. And porn's capacity to thrive only exists insofar as men are already collectively traumatized in various ways and cut off from our sexuality from many, many generations up the line, which speaks to the broader work that many of us are involved in. So I think creating spaces for deep healing and vulnerability is really key to this. And also having this sort of discourse and awareness around sexuality for people who are in partnerships, that sexuality isn't just about getting it off and getting your fix and having fun. It can also be the place where these deep moments of healing arise, and to have that orientation to be able to turn towards that from just having a sexually fulfilling time to like, oh, like, let's go into this, in the context of our sexual relationship. And I've been fortunate to have partners who were able to go to that place with me, and that through that process I've discovered like, wow, there's so much more here, and there's such a depth of healing that is possible when we go through our sexuality directly. So that's part of the big picture to healing this as well. I don't think kind of stepping back from porn is sufficient at all.
That said, though, you have made a commitment in the Resonant Man.
Yes, I have. I have made a 1 year no porn commitment to the Resonant Man, largely as a result of feeling like I've actually reached the place to be able to fulfill that, coming out of some really deep ayahuasca ceremonies earlier this year in Peru. Um, but this is for me the fruition of like years and years of like having this reality of like I've become increasingly conscious of this. I'm talking about it with other men. I'm really like helping other men understand it themselves, and yet still I'm slipping into it. But I'm sharing about the fact that I'm slipping into it. And so it's been a very gradual process for me.
Yeah, and I think as I recall, the fact that you made that commitment was part of the inspiration for this event. Like, we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation with this many people had you not made that commitment in the group. And so we see the ripple of your work on this topic touching more and more people, which I find very inspiring. And I also want to say that I do really admire the courage that you've shown, not only in terms of facing your own shadow around this addictive pattern, but in speaking about it and being so transparent in your process. Because I think that is, as you said, how we begin to heal this. We bring it into relationship. It's not about shutting it down, fragmenting. Even when we relapse, or when we recognize that we're going back into that old loop, if we can bring that, say, into the space of a men's circle, it's not only healing for that individual, but it's also has a healing effect on everyone who witnesses it, who may be struggling with very similar conditioning. So that to me is like really inspiring. And I just want to say on a personal note how powerful I think your work in particular is in this domain. And
Thank you.
yeah,
Thank you,
yeah,
Matthew. Feeling
it's a
honored
big,
by your words.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's very meaningful. And one or two people have landed in the space in the last few minutes. You're very welcome. You're all very welcome. Some old friends arriving, and I know some of you may not be able to put your cameras on for various reasons, but you're very welcome to join us on camera if you are able to as well. But we understand that it's not always possible for people who are cooking their dinner or looking after their kids or whatever you're doing. So you're very welcome. You're very welcome. Yeah, just holding that thought for a moment, bringing this collective wound, we could say, into our shared awareness, even as we convene in this space together, bringing Jacob's experience into our shared awareness. Maybe his experiences touching on experiences in our own lives of some kind, in the lives of people close to us. As we gather intentionally in this way, we are not only discussing this topic, we are already beginning to alchemize this collective tendency, this conditioning, this patterning that has somehow arisen in our culture through a combination of technology and through the search for a release from the symptoms often of some kind of trauma, whether that's the trauma suffered by individual men, perhaps. We, of course, remember the trauma impacting the women who are often engaging in producing this material under some form of duress. And we recognize the impact that it has on all those touched indirectly. Thinking of Jacob speaking about how the medicine of LSD allowed him to recognize that there was actually no separation, that his life had a holographic quality in a sense, that what he felt was happening in a separate sphere was actually with him every day. And how many of us may have similar experiences, not necessarily relating to porn, but with many other forms of the collective and intergenerational wounds that live in all of us in unique ways. And presencing the courage we're all showing by approaching this topic together with a willingness to see, to feel, to sense into this inquiry. What is it that we are encountering here? What is it that we are contending with? And what has drawn each of us into this process together? Yeah, I'm feeling great gratitude for all of you today and wondering if anyone else wants to bring in a comment or a resonance, question, observation. I think I'm seeing a question in the chat that I could speak to from. Yeah, great to hear from you. Yeah, saying, I'm not in a private space and unable to speak out, but I'd love to raise a question. How do you navigate feelings of shame while weaning off porn, especially when framing the journey in terms of the sacred versus the profane? Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Would you like to offer some words, Jacob?
Yeah, I think part of the inheritance and part of the generational baggage around this is the shame, especially from Catholic and other Abrahamic religious traditions. There's an enormous amount of shame that's added to the bonfire, and I don't believe we need to carry any of that. I think we can be completely free of that, and I don't think there's. I think of shame as something we're adding on to the experience. So it's not to say that authentically being with my experience after pornography doesn't mean there's going to be negative affect, but then there's something extra that can be added. There's a story that I can be adding on. There's a kind of like whipping myself that can be added to that. And that what I discovered through my own process, because I did go through a stage where I had that extra piece, that extra shame. That's part of what keeps you stuck. The shame and the use cycle are intimately connected. So it's actually through just saying, look, there's no shame in this. There's no moral wrong. I'm not morally wrong for doing this. That you take a step towards being more free from it, in my experience. So I would say ridding of shame is a great way to step towards actually breaking the habit. And how to do that is, a personal and spiritual question of finding whether it's through connection with other men or through connection with the divine. Um, I am hankering to hear more voices, also different ages and genders and backgrounds in the space. But I wanted to read this question from Elizabeth. Can you please say more about men's generational sexual trauma history? Yeah, briefly on this, I think we focus so much on the Hubel work on war and the effect of war. I think that what I've started to realize over the last few years is there's kind of a fractal depth to the sexual organs, and they hold like a depth that we don't really understand. And so the trauma, which of course can be stored in the heart and the mind and different parts of the body, like the sexual organs can hold it with such a depth, and therefore it is actually through properly approaching them that the deepest traumas can also be released, because there's such a depth of vulnerability in that area, and the way to sort of release the deepest trauma is to kind of create safety around the deepest vulnerability. Um, um, yeah, and then a lot of men have had bullying from other boys as teenagers. There's all kinds of things that can happen at the school playground level, which can feed into this. A weird feature of my upbringing was there was a craze in my school of boys slapping each other in the nuts, called nut slapping, which was considered to be very funny at the time. Um, but I only realized years later when like someone would go near my nuts that I would flinch. And it was because this nut slap game had been played so many times in school that it was actually, become entrained in my body to not be safe in that way. So that's one small component of it. And then finally, before handing it off, just to honor the recognition and grief that I came to, that really to engage, to touch, to penetrate another person or a woman from a place of disconnection is not only a trauma to the other, it's a trauma to oneself. And to get to a place of really feeling that and honoring that was a really, really powerful part of my journey as well. And I think that's the most direct way in which male porn use is affecting all women, because we're entering their bodies from a place of disconnection and other rather than of togetherness.
That's a very powerful point that you landed on there, Jacob, and this idea that disconnected sex is actually a trauma for both participants. And it aligns very closely with my understanding of Thomas Hubel's teaching around trauma in general, that when we break what might be called divine law, which obviously can be interpreted in many ways, but in this case, by in a sense violating the values of sacred sexuality by engaging in sex in the way you describe, there is a breach, and we both suffer. But one of us may suffer almost the victim side of the equation, and the other might suffer the perpetration side, the shadow trauma, but they're both bound together and entangled. And actually, we're then entangled until there's some restoration, which, if that's the case, it does put our sexual ethics in a very different light. And certainly I can think about, when I was growing up, nothing like this was ever even considered. There was no conversation around these topics. And it was only in much later life, through men's work, that I was fortunate enough to begin to encounter spaces to have these conversations, or to even arrive at some even basic teachings around sexual energy, retaining sexual energy, how that can change the quality of a sexual experience or interaction or relationship. And this to me was a revelation. And I would say that it opened up the world of sacred sexuality that you're pointing at. And I'm not suggesting in any way that that's something that I've fully integrated, but certainly my approach to sex has definitely changed in a way that has been very healing for me, and actually really nourished my marriage. And I think part of the answer too, I think as you were saying, I agree, is that we need to make this kind of education much more widely available, because it doesn't take that much, in my experience, for big shifts in the direction of a more sacred approach to sexuality to become possible. It's not that difficult, actually. Turns out, when you have some basic protocols and so on. um and of course, that's the journey of a lifetime, not to diminish that, but I do believe that big changes are possible in a relatively short amount of time for men. And then, for speaking here as a men's group, of course. Um, but yeah, also curious. Oh, I'm sorry, Kaya. Kaya has a comment in the chat I just meant to read for everyone. Kaya's had to go off camera, and hopefully we'll catch up with what we're sharing maybe later on the recording. Kaya's saying it's great what you're bringing. Thank you so much. Very grateful for the opportunity to hear and know about this topic from the view of honest and vulnerable men. This should be spread far broader, as I believe so many people are concerned or affected by this practice. So, yeah, thank you, Kaya. It's great to have you here. And thank you to both of us, but especially you, Jacob, as you're opening up so courageously about this. And yeah, I wholeheartedly echo that. Yeah, and the space is still open, of course, if anyone else has a question or observation they'd like to throw in. And a reminder, too, that moments of silence and digestion are also very welcome. Mm. Yeah, it's good to feel the feel deepening. So much that has been brought forward, and so many aspects of this hyper object, you might say, that we could begin to explore. Oh, and we have a question from Udwak in the chat. It's great to have you here, Udwak. I won't embarrass you by saying how far back we go, but it's great to see you. Udwak is saying, apologies for coming late. You may have touched on this. I wonder about the distortions of cultures around sex through colonialism, patriarchy, and so on. Wow, that is a really interesting question on colonialism in particular. Maybe I could speak to that maybe briefly, and turn it over to Jacob and the whole field. And obviously, Uduak would love to hear more from you on this topic if you're in a position to type any further in the chat. I think I think what comes to me when you bring in colonialism, and even that word, I just want to give a little space to, and I want to invite everybody to just take a moment to sense any response you notice in your system as I bring that word from Uduak into the space. And we begin the inquiry of how does colonialism relate to porn, or how does porn relate to colonialism? And I guess what is immediately coming up for me is this a sense of power over. And Jacob spoke about porn as a rupture in relationship at many different levels. And I think we could think of colonialism as the ultimate rupture, the ultimate imposition of power, of oppression, exploitation, which ran rampant around the globe in a very recognizable form for centuries, but which of course continues today in many other forms. And it feels to me like the fundamental fractal pattern, to use Jacob's word, that we find in colonialism and what colonialism represents around the 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 psychic structure of industrial societies must map very closely to the kind of exploitation that we see in the porn industry, the habits of consumption. Just as in a colonial structure, we can consume products that are generated at the expense of populations in the colonized countries, whether that's colonized in the 18th and 19th century sense or colonized through exploitative economic systems of today. We can map that very directly to consuming porn without regard for the cost of its manufacture as a product. And we touched briefly, maybe too briefly in this dialogue, on the impact of porn, and speaking particularly about porn made using women, images of women. We obviously want to presence them in this space. And as we presence those women, I also think of our relationship with the divine feminine, with the earth, with Mother Earth. If we're able to approach women as men in such a disposable manner as we do through the industry of pornography, then that will relate to exploitation of the earth. And ultimately, as I think Jacob was explaining so eloquently, it's a profane act, and it's perhaps disconnecting us from the divine feminine that is, or should be, available to all of us in some way. But through our trauma, through our addiction, we push further and further away. So that's what comes to me in response to your question. And I think it's a beautiful, powerful inquiry. And I don't know whether you're in a position to type any more, Udwak, but of course your voice is very welcome if you have more to say on that. And equally, if anyone else has reflections on this intersection, then that's also very welcome.
Yeah, Yang, love to hear your voice on this.
Thank you. And also, I want to preface it actually by saying, because I've already raised my voice, so if there's anyone that wants to interrupt me, feel free to do so. Okay. But if not, I will share this piece. I really want to appreciate Uduak, appreciate you for bringing both of these up. I feel like there's a lot in me that wants to respond to both. So first to patriarchy. Um, I feel like I really want to express how much I feel suppressed and constrained by patriarchy as a man. Like, to return to what I shared about the sex drive and the sexuality. I think that I feel like there are glimpses of a sexuality in me, which very gracefully my partner Ying actually recognizes in me in a recent conversation, which I'm really appreciative of because I've always been, yeah, ashamed, you know, um, like I thought I only have a sex drive. And there's a lot of shame on that. But in a way, kind of like what Jacob said, like when I can really hold space for the shame I have for my sex drive, that in itself added to a deepening and broadening of the space and a potentially emerging sexuality. Yeah, and I do feel like patriarchy deprives me from even having this conversation. Again, maybe I'll express this in very uncouth terms, because it's very rare that the men between men we can discuss sexuality in a manner like this. In like the maybe like high school dorm rooms, it's really about, who has the best, boobs or who has the greatest legs. It's all discussion and what are we fantasizing we're gonna do to that. Like that's kind of the only option I feel like patriarchy is offering me. Like that's what sex is about. Period. Yeah, so this is what I want to say in response to patriarchy. That I feel like men and women, I feel like gay or straight, we should all be on the same team to go beyond that. Okay. And then to colonialism, which perhaps even more, I find it even harder to express the piece over here. There are a lot of shame and I haven't really explored this in depth enough, and it's also a very sensitive topic, so I want to be really careful with my words here. Um, so, and this is a topic that I have taught. I've been a psychology teacher in Shenzhen in China for 3 years and a half. This is a topic that I have taught about how for many straight Chinese guys, we have internalized the Western colonial system of favoring white skin color than dark skin or black skin color. I'll give you an example. On our YouTube, because we can't access to YouTube, right? But in our like video platform, if you see it's a commonplace to see a Chinese woman with with a white man. That's a very common pairing. And whenever there is a Chinese man with a white woman, it attracts a lot of attention. And for me, there was a time when I can't really look at that because it will trigger a lot of, I feel like there's a part of me that also is longing for that in a way. because of how, you know, Chinese Asian men are represented generally in the Western imagination. Like I want to overcome sort of that inadequacy by being with white women. That's the way to sort of compensate for that wound. And on the contrary, there's debate, which I won't get into, whether like the Chinese involvement in Africa, like to what extent can it be seen as colonialism? It's kind of a debate, but I won't get into. But what I wanted to say is that when I see on that video platform when it's a Chinese man with a black woman, the Chinese like the Chinese man actually had to defend his relationship first and foremost. You know, I hope that this is not, you know, triggering or, you know, and if so, please do let me know. If people hear that, you know, like, but I feel like this is something really raw and real. But again, also I feel like it's we all are aware of it, but it's very rare that we kind of discuss it. Yeah, so I guess this piece is that, like, as a supposedly someone who historically has been more colonized, that we also internalize this, you know, value or you know, this separation, you know, this hierarchy, you know, that the colonizers have imposed. Yeah. Okay, so that would be the piece.
Yeah, thanks, Yang. Thank you for that very powerful reflection, a very transparent and vulnerable reflection, both in relationship to patriarchy, what it deprives us of as men, depriving us perhaps of this kind of space that we're creating now, and also this experience in relation to colonialism. Udwak has come on the screen. I was going to, I think this is a great moment to bring you in. I was about to read out your comments in the chat, but I think you can speak for yourself now, if you're all able to.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Jacob. And I apologize to everyone for coming late. And I won't embarrass Matt by saying how far back we go, but we met in our formative years and we seem to be in a similar journey of unlearning. And both of us escaped corporate media. I certainly burnt out. Look, this is an important conversation, and I'm sorry that I came late. It's late in Kenya. I'm in Kenya at the moment. I've been in Germany for the last 2 years. And as you come into awareness, I coach as well. I'm going deeper into these sorts of inquiries. And Yang, thank you for your response, because there are layers to this in terms of the commodification of sex, but also who is used for sex and whose sexual purity is maintained, who is seen as desirable for sex and who is seen as desirable for reproduction. Because we're all grown here and there's a reason why we're here. You know, so in terms of exploring, you know, what I was seeing around me, you know, whether it's, you know, arguing with my young nephews about porn and, you know, trying to influence them away from it, there really is no teaching around sex and sexuality, even for us as women, you know, not knowing, not being in touch, you know, with yourself, recognizing when you're middle-aged that, oh, that experience I had, you know, I didn't want it, you know, but I didn't necessarily know, you know, what was happening or what was, you know, how to advocate for myself. You know, Matthew, when you talked to Matthew and Jacob, when you talked about the disconnection and the trauma that's perpetrated on both parties, I guess for me, it then becomes, how do we go into, and I think every culture at some point had some container for sacred divine connection, which we lost along the way. You know, colonialism, patriarchy, various isms, capitalism. If you think about people working in factories, you had no time to engage with each other, you know, in a loving manner, in a sacred manner. And so when we then have these conversations, you know, how do we move forward in terms of, I don't know. I mean, this is a healing conversation because it's allowing us to process. But this has been centuries in the making. I think porn and the technology is really just reflective of some form of fragmentation in the psyche. If you think about war, and one of the spoils of war was the ability to rape both men and women, okay, to establish dominance. And I don't know, it really just feels like a lot. It feels like a lot, particularly if you haven't had the space to, you know, Matt, you were talking about men's groups and unlearning, you know, various things. And so how then, I mean, certainly in Kenya with my nephews, I've been involved in taking them through men's programs. And, you know, with various groups, I am the auntie who, you know, has very honest you know, conversations with my nieces and nephews. But, you know, among people of our generation, you cannot have this conversation. People aren't present to themselves. They're not alive to, you know, what's happening. And when I look at the older generation, my parents, my mother, the people who grew up in colonialism, there is an alienation, a disconnection with their bodies. I see it. It's very visible. No wonder people are looking to porn then, to learn and then find themselves addicted, and then you start medicating using porn, and then the disconnection deepens. Sorry, I have no wisdom for you. I think I'm throwing out my frustration. But thank you, Matt. Thank you for this space.
That feels like a lot of wisdom to me, Udwak. Auntie Udwak. Your nieces and nephews are very fortunate to have you keeping your watchful eye on them in Nairobi. Yeah, but what you said as well in the chat about cultures losing these sacred rights and the conversations that would have happened between auntie and niece and nephew over generations somehow being severed at some point, and the relationship between that and colonialism, and the severing of that in the colonizing culture as well. Perhaps that may have been necessary for the whole colonial project to be possible at some level, for so many people to be instrumentalized in that way. I feel like we've touched on a very rich seam that perhaps we can continue to excavate, but it's really great to have your voice here.
Yeah, on that note, I just wanted to say that I really receive you and receive your contributions deeply. I really appreciated them. I think, to speak from my own experience, I've come into relationship with those moments and thresholds through being in relationship with Chinese partners when I was in university, and more recently living in Mexico with Mexican women who come from a very sexually repressive Catholic culture. And as a man, you can come into these situations where you're in a sexual interaction and you can become aware that the other person is really just they're being there to serve you, and they're not actually being there out of a connection with their own consent. And sometimes they're even saying they're ready for things when they're not ready for them. And I think we have such a profound responsibility as men in healing this to actually really, really be present to ourselves and to the other in those moments. And I think that's when shift can begin to occur, is actually in the intimacy of the bedroom, when you catch that moment and you open it out and you illuminate what's here. Like, oh, are you actually here? Are you actually ready or not? And to speak to what was coming with Young, and also the thread of colonialism, I think that in this context of sexuality, the colonizer is colonized. The colonizer's sexuality has been colonized, and the characteristics of it are the disconnection. And you can see it very plainly in the anxiety that men and young men have around only having an erect penis, and that not having that is this great source of letdown and shame, and all this pressurization to put on a show. And there's such a process of deconstructing that has to occur. And I think that is the bridge from the sex drive to the sexuality that Yang was talking about, and also for men to be able to experience their feminine nature in the context of sex as well, is really important piece of this. Yeah, it's a lot of work can happen.
We have about 5 more minutes before we are going to move to gradually close the space by past. And in the Resonant Man, we always leave at least 2 minutes at the end just to be together with a little attunement to digest, to integrate all that's been surfaced, and mindful that we've touched on some very deep topics, some very deep collective wounds together. It's important that we have a little space at the end just to fade out together as well. But we do have a few more minutes for dialogue. Did I see, Raphael, your hand up? Welcome.
Hello, it's lovely to be here, be part of the circle now.
Yeah.
I'm happy for the invitation. And yeah, I can definitely resonate with this topic. I think it's a topic for almost everyone on this planet. I don't know who is not watching porn, or who at least was not watching porn once in his life. So I'm questioning myself, what is the root issue in here? Like, why do we have this industry and this complex, and why don't we just meet our opposites in a respectful, peaceful way, where we, in the way as it should be, and where we know and our heart knows it's possible. Also, we hopefully all of us experienced this sacred way of how it could be to interact with each other in a sexual way. So I'm questioning myself, why is it not like this? And for me, through my own experiences through life, I come to the point that I think, or I feel, most of the people on this planet are stuck in their mind, and they're not living inside of their body, and they're not feeling what the body actually wants, but the body is containing the true wisdom and not the mind. That's what I believe. And therefore, I believe and I think in this circle, most of the people, or everyone actually, is like following the wisdom of the body and traveling back into ourselves. So I believe that's the way to get out of the mind. And now the question is how to open this space, or how to broaden it, to bring it up to more people on this planet. Because I think when people start feeling and recognizing the language of their body again, they know what they want or what they don't want. And they don't recognize it afterwards, like, oh, I haven't been doing something I haven't wanted to do. Because I think this is something many people still experience, but it's just because they are not listening to themselves. And I would love to be part of this movement to help people somehow, I don't know, to get back inside of their bodies and quiet their mind down, and also get in touch with their own sexuality again. Because definitely sexuality is repressed, especially in men, and the shame is such a huge problem. But also shame is an invitation. There's no shame, no need to be ashamed. Why should we? Yeah. I'm curious, what's your thoughts on that? I mean, this whole topic is so huge, it's hard for me to, yeah. I think it's really nice that we opened this topic, and I think it deserves more space, more time, more conversations, because it's not possible to, yeah, bring it all out in 1 hour.
Yeah, I love that contribution, Raphael. And I've often used the word porn mind, to describe that conditioned state of awareness. And I do think the end of porn mind is the beginning of body mind, and the inverse to all of the constraints and conditioning of pornography for me has been the process of like the actual discovery of the body, and there's so many layers and subtleties to really inhabiting our bodies that can't be taught propositionally or in a book, but you can kind of hold an initiatory space of relating and support people to go along in that. And yeah, there's so much more to being in my body as a man to me now at 29 than there was at 18 or 23 or even 25. So I want to invite people to, and invite myself, to there being even more to be found within the body, as a portal to sacred depth of experience.
Yeah, I think I referenced a men's group I was in that was very focused on sexuality for 3 months. And one of the practices was, the homework was, I think was it 3 times a week to spend half an hour like touching your body as a man. Like, what do I like? Like, and it was like, this is the weirdest thing I've ever done. Like, but actually, who knew? Like, I have nipples. All this kind of discovery was possible that would never have happened because of porn mind, right? Because of that kind of narrow predatory focus on the outcome of all this performance, when actually just sort of exploring, well, how do I like to be touched? It was revelation for me. And it's why I support what you're saying, Raphael. Like, it comes up again and again in this conversation. How do we pass this knowledge on, these practices, this conversation to men? Because it's not happening mostly. And that's partly why we created the Resonant Man as part of a much bigger project of cultural transformation, so that we can create a space where men can come together to broach all kinds of topics that we don't normally talk about. And the beauty of these open events is, of course, we also welcome women, because that's, of course, where the real alchemy happens as well. So honoring everybody who's present today as we bring our session gently to a close. We'll take a few minutes just to settle, and of course, thanking everyone for your time and your presence and your attention to the work we're doing in the Resonant Man. The doors are open until June the 3rd, if I'm right, Jacob. For those who, June the 1st, for those who may wish to join us in the weekly men's circle, simply drop me or Jacob a line and we can move forward with that. Obviously, we're very grateful to anyone who's able to help spread the word about this initiative. I always think about men's work that if only men knew what it actually was, we'd be inundated with participants. But it's overcoming that hump of resistance that I certainly felt years ago before I discovered men's work, and finding ways to speak to men and the women who are likely to send men our way. So maybe there are a few of you here this evening. But with that, yeah, let's just take a few moments, just take a breath. Exhaling, acknowledging our courage and our commitment today. And softening with the recognition that we have touched on some very deep fields of trauma, collective trauma living in us, intergenerational trauma. But by bringing this trauma into a field of shared awareness, we begin to thaw those layers. And as we thaw those layers, new possibilities become available. And perhaps if it feels good to you, just inviting light into the space, inviting light to cascade down from above, inviting that soul's light to wash through your body, illuminating you, illuminating this space, perhaps feeling the other beings present here also connecting with that shared light together. The light that is always available to us, is always supporting us, seeking our availability for healing for ourselves, for those around us, for our communities, even for this metacrisis that can seem so overwhelming, can seem to be everywhere and nowhere at once. We can always offer ourselves as channels of this light and the healing intelligence that animates it.
Blessing the courage to open spaces of dialogue around these themes. In which presence itself can be a healing. For all of the hurts and disconnections that have been present in the field today. We invite a recognition that no disconnection truly lasts, and that the richness is in the journey itself.
Thank you, everybody. And feel free to unmute as we close the circle. It's always good to hear your voices as we gradually disperse. feeling very grateful for all of your presence here, and yeah, hoping some of you may join us in the Resonant Man on a weekly basis.
Mm.
Thanks, everybody. Really
Thank you.
appreciate
Yeah.
your presence.
Everyone,
Good to see you, Tracy. Thank you for being here today.
pleasure, yeah.
Yeah, it's good to be part of you. I'm curious where the journey leads.
Yeah.
See you
See you
again.
again. See you again, Raphael. See you, Wolfgang.
Hi. Yes.
Good to hear your voice.
Oh, thank you.
Great to see you, Udwak. So good to have you here. Wow. Wow. We have
Wait,
lots more to talk about.
Yes, there's a lot to talk about. We're doing similar-ish work, I think. But this is quite a space you've created, and so congratulations on the transition. I know it can't have been easy.
I think I'm still transitioning, Udwak. I don't think I've arrived yet. I think I'm in a permanent state of transition.
We're constantly arriving, but well done.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll connect and continue.
Okay. All right. So do we leave now, or are we
Yeah,
still
we're just hanging out this time, but yeah, we're closing the space now. Yeah. See you.
Thank you, Yang. Thank you so very much. Jacob, thank
No,
you.
you-
Okay.
Likewise. Great to meet you.
Good to meet you too.
so great to
You
meet
be
you.
well. Yeah, you be well. It's 10:30 now.
Wow.
In Kenya. Okay. All right. Oh yeah. Bye.